enough to hush the courtroom, but not louder than the words that came next. "You again? What is it with you people always ending up in my courtroom?" The old judge's voice carried with a venom masked in legal decorum, the kind that didn't shout its hate, but whispered it, smug and dismissive, like it had nothing left to learn. 17-year-old Tyrell Mason stood frozen. He hadn't even sat down yet. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie, jeans a little too big, hands in his pockets, but his eyes were razor sharp, scanning the courtroom like a chessboard. The officer beside him leaned in and whispered, "Don't give him a reason, kid." Tyrell didn't flinch. He stepped forward. He'd been in courtrooms before, but never like this. Today wasn't about justice. It was about judgment. And the man behind the bench, Judge Walter Greaves, had already made up his mind. Tyrell had been picked up for trespassing, supposedly caught skating behind a downtown law office. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't tagging. He was just there. Wrong place. Wrong hoodie. Wrong color. The arresting officer even admitted the fence had a gap in it. No damage. No priors. Nothing violent. But Judge Greaves didn't care. He read the file, chuckled to himself, and said, "Looks about right. Hoodie, no job, no direction. Just another statistic in the making." People in the pews shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads. Some were used to it. But what came next caught everyone off guard. Greaves leaned forward, smiling like a snake. "Let me guess, Mom's working 2 jobs. Daddy skipped town before you were born." A soft gasp came from a woman in the back. Tyrell's jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, but said nothing. That silence was louder than anything he could have shouted. And Judge Greaves? He laughed. A cold, dry laugh. "Did I hit a nerve? Son, this courtroom doesn't care about feelings. It cares about facts." The fact was, Greaves saw a black teen in a hoodie and assumed he knew the story. But he didn't know the chapter he'd just opened. Tyrell wasn't folding. He wasn't angry, at least not on the surface. But there was something in the way he stood. Not defeated, not scared. It was something else. Composure, control, confidence. Like he knew something no one else in the room did. Greaves leaned back in his chair, annoyed now. He motioned to the bailiff. "I don't have all day. I've got real cases to deal with." But just as he was about to hand down the sentence, the public defender stood to speak, and Tyrell held up his hand. "Let me say it." Greaves raised an eyebrow. "Now you've got something to say." Tyrell looked him dead in the eyes. "Yeah, I do." And in that moment, the tension in the courtroom thickened. Spectators leaned forward. The silence was deafening, because what Tyrell was about to say next wouldn't just shift the room. It would flip the entire case on its head. But he didn't say it. Not yet. He looked around, then back at the judge. And then, like a slow burn fuse about to reach the dynamite, he said just 6 words. "You don't know who I am." Judge Greaves leaned forward slowly, narrowing his eyes. "Son, I don't care who you are. This isn't a talent show." Tyrell didn't blink. He repeated his words, this time slower, as if each syllable carried weight. "You don't know who I am." A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. The public defender shifted uncomfortably beside him. Tyrell hadn't told her anything, just said he'd speak for himself. The judge chuckled again, tapping his gavel like it was a joke. "All right, Shakespeare, enlighten me. Who are you?" That's when Tyrell looked over his shoulder. Just once. And then, the back door creaked open. The courtroom turned. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a tailored navy suit stepped in. Calm, quiet, controlled. He walked like he owned the room. Like he wasn't there to ask questions, but to deliver consequences. Even Judge Greaves paused. He recognized power when it entered the room. He just didn't recognize the man. Tyrell turned back to the judge and said, "That's who I am." The man in the suit stepped forward and handed a letter to the bailiff. It was sealed, embossed, official. The judge squinted as he read the name on it. Then his expression twisted in confusion, then discomfort, and finally fear. The courtroom went still. The letter was from the State Attorney General's office, and the man standing before them? Deputy Attorney General Marcus Langston, one of the most respected and feared prosecutors in the state, and also Tyrell's father. Judge Greaves sat back in his chair, color draining from his face. He had no idea. This wasn't some random street kid. This was the son of a man who could, and would, drag Greaves through every form of legal hell if needed. But Marcus Langston didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply turned to his son and asked, "You good?" Tyrell nodded, though his eyes were wet. You could tell he'd been carrying the weight of judgment his whole life. The judge's laughter, the racial undertones, the presumption of guilt. It wasn't new to him. But today, it was the last straw. What the courtroom didn't know, and what Marcus would soon reveal, is that this wasn't the first time Judge Greaves had crossed paths with his family. 12 years ago, Marcus Langston had filed a judicial bias complaint against Greaves for wrongfully sentencing Tyrell's mother to jail time over a minor misdemeanor. She'd lost her job, her home, everything. And though Marcus had fought it, he lost. Greaves had connections. Back then, Marcus wasn't powerful enough. But now he was. Judge Greaves tried to recover. I wasn't aware of the relationship. Had I known, I would have treated him like a human being. Marcus cut in, voice like steel. Or do you only respect black boys when you know they have powerful fathers? Greaves stuttered, but the damage was done. The courtroom was silent, but not empty. The weight of the truth had filled every inch of air. Tyrell stood tall, not because of his father's title, but because he finally saw the scales tip just a little back toward justice. And Greaves, he was exposed, not for breaking the law, but for twisting it against the ones who could never fight back. Until now, the courtroom had grown tense, a heavy silence hanging in the air like the thick humidity outside. The judge, Walter Greaves, stared down at the papers before him, his fingers tapping impatiently on the gavel. Tyrell Mason, 17, stood before him, dressed in a faded hoodie and a look that conveyed far more than words ever could. The courtroom was filled with weary black families, used to this, used to the way the system stacked the odds against them. Tyrell's public defender, a young woman with nervous energy, fidgeted with her notes. She had tried to speak up earlier, but Judge Greaves had cut her off with a dismissive wave, clearly enjoying his position of power over this kid, this troublemaker in front of him. Tyrell's offense: trespassing, skateboarding with friends on private property. Minor in the grand scheme of things. But in this courtroom, where judgment was harsh and swift, the details didn't matter. Greaves had already made up his mind. Another one of you, huh? Judge Greaves muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. A future dropout. Wasting my time. He scoffed, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Tyrell's eyes locked onto the judge's, cold, steady, unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't react the way Greaves had expected. It was the calm before a storm. Greaves smirked. What's the matter? Didn't know your pants were falling down? Where's your belt, son? You look like you're ready for a street corner, not a courtroom. Tyrell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. The families knew what was coming. Another harsh sentence. Another black teenager getting chewed up by the system. Greaves, sensing victory, turned the moment into a sermon. You kids think the world owes you something. Let me guess. No father around to teach you how to act. No real man in your life to show you what discipline looks like. He shot a look toward the defense attorney, daring her to speak up again. The room froze. Tyrell's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stone cold. It was a familiar routine, prejudices disguised as wisdom. The whispers grew louder, but no one dared to speak out. Judge Greaves had been like this for years. But then, Tyrell did something unexpected. He took a slow step forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'll take the community service," he said, his words calm but firm. "But you're wrong about my dad." The room went silent. Greaves raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and just who is your dad, then? Should I know him?" Tyrell didn't flinch. He spoke slowly, deliberately, each word sharp like a knife. "His name's Judge Marcus Mason." The room seemed to hold its breath, and then came the gasps. A few heads turned. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gallery. Greaves froze. He looked at Tyrell, eyes narrowing as though he hadn't heard correctly. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely a whisper, and for the first time that day, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Tyrell's face remained unreadable. "Judge Marcus Mason, my father, the first black federal judge in this state. You used to clerk under him, didn't you?" There was no denying the shift in the room. People sat up straighter. Even the public defender glanced at Tyrell with newfound respect. Greaves, on the other hand, was visibly rattled, his grip tightening on the gavel. "You're lying," Greaves said, but there was no conviction in his words. His voice shook ever so slightly. Tyrell didn't flinch. He was a great man. He never gave up on anyone, not even on you. The judge's face went pale, like all the blood had drained from it in an instant. His eyes darted to the gallery, but no one was looking at Tyrell now. They were looking at him, the judge who had once been mentored by Marcus Mason, the man who had shaped the very legacy of fairness in this state. Tyrell's voice dropped, steady and calm. "You used to admire him. I know. He believed in second chances." The courtroom seemed to shudder. The weight of Tyrell's words hung heavy in the air. Greaves swallowed hard, his throat dry. It was like a wall had been broken down, exposing something raw and vulnerable inside him. A man who had once been a student of integrity, now reduced to a bitter caricature of himself. Judge Greaves couldn't find his words at first. He stood there, staring at Tyrell as though seeing a ghost from his past. The truth of what had been said settled in. Greaves had once been Marcus Mason's protege, his rising star, someone who had once been filled with the same hope, the same belief in justice. But over time, as the years had passed and his resentment had festered, Greaves had grown cynical. The man who had been Marcus' best pupil had become one of the system's most harsh, unrelenting figures. Greaves' mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked around the courtroom, almost as though searching for someone to pull him back from this moment. But there was no escape. Finally, his voice broke through the silence. "Your father, he was a great man." It wasn't a statement of judgment, but an admission. He could no longer hide from it. Tyrell nodded, his voice low but full of strength, and he believed in second chances. For the first time in the entire hearing, Judge Greaves hesitated. The weight of Tyrell's words, of Marcus Mason's legacy, crushed the smugness that had once defined him. He sighed deeply, a long, weighted exhale, as though a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the gavel. For a moment, it seemed as though the gavel would fall like it always had before, final, unforgiving. But then, Greaves did something no one in the room expected. "I'm going to reduce your sentence," he said, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "You will still serve community service, but I'm going to clear your record." He paused, glancing at Tyrell with a newfound respect. "I'll assign you to a youth mentorship program. Your father helped set it up." Tyrell's eyes locked onto Greaves for the first time. There was no anger in them now, only a quiet dignity, the same dignity his father had carried with him all those years. The judge cleared his throat. "Your father was a man who understood the value of redemption. He believed that everyone deserved a chance to change." Tyrell nodded, accepting the shift in the room, accepting the change in the judge. As Tyrell turned to leave the courtroom, the spectators whispered among themselves. One murmured, "He's just like his dad." And for the first time in his career, Judge Greaves felt the full weight of his robe, no longer just a shield for authority, but a reminder of the man he had once aspired to be. Injustice blinked, just for a second, and for that second, the system had been forced to see the humanity it had long ignored. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy tension. Judge Greaves sat at the bench, his knuckles white as they gripped the gavel. His mind was far from the proceedings at hand, far from the young man in front of him, the one who had dared to name-drop Marcus Mason, the man who had been a mentor to him, the man whose legacy was still alive in the courthouse, though it now felt like a distant memory. Tyrell Mason, 17 years old, stood there unwavering. He was still the quiet, composed teenager who had just shocked the courtroom with the revelation that his father was none other than the late Judge Marcus Mason, the first black federal judge in the state, a man who had carved a path of justice and fairness so deep that even now, his name echoed Judge Greaves shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to force his gaze back to the papers in front of him. But all he could see was the face of Marcus Mason, smiling down at him from the days when Greaves had been an eager law clerk, wide-eyed and ambitious. Back then, Greaves had been nothing more than a young man trying to make a name for himself in a world that didn't make space for him. He had admired Marcus Mason, no. He had looked up to him, hoped to emulate his quiet strength, his wisdom. But now, as Greaves felt the weight of the room pressing down on him, he realized how far he had fallen, how far Marcus Mason's influence had slipped through his fingers, replaced by bitterness, resentment, and an overwhelming desire for control. Years ago, Greaves had been the rising star in the courthouse. He had been chosen by Marcus Mason himself to be his law clerk, and for a while, it had felt like the world was his. The old judge had believed in him, had taken him under his wing. They had talked for hours, debated cases, discussed the fine line between justice and mercy. Marcus had taught him that the law wasn't just a set of rules. It was a way to lift people up, to give them the opportunity to be better than their circumstances. But over time, something had shifted. Greaves had watched as Marcus' star rose higher and higher, as the community respected him, admired him, and Greaves had remained on the sidelines, bitter, waiting for his moment to shine. That resentment had festered, turning into a dangerous cocktail of jealousy and pride. When Marcus Mason had retired, Greaves had seen his chance. But instead of honoring the legacy of his mentor, Greaves had used his position to enforce the rules with an iron fist, cold, detached, and unforgiving. The present moment snapped back with a harsh jolt as Greaves looked up at Tyrell. The boy was still standing there, calm, unshaken, as if nothing in the world could touch him. But it was clear that Tyrell had already seen through the facade. He had already understood what was really happening here. "I don't know what you're trying to do with me, Judge," Tyrell said, his voice steady but sharp. "You can't break me. I know who I am, and I know who my father was." Greaves stared at the boy. He didn't speak, but in his mind, the floodgates of memory opened. He thought of the days spent under Marcus Mason's guidance, how he had trusted him, learned from him. But those days had been so long ago, buried under the weight of Greaves' own choices, his own need for power. Tyrell's father had believed in second chances. He had believed that even the most hardened criminals deserved the opportunity to make amends, to be redeemed. Greaves, however, had built his career on punishment. The idea of mercy felt like a weakness now, something he had pushed aside for too long. He was no longer the eager clerk who had once sat in Marcus Mason's office, absorbing wisdom like a sponge. He was a judge who had grown jaded, who had learned to wield the law as a weapon, not a tool for healing. Greaves cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your father was a good man, Tyrell. A great man," he said, but the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Tyrell or himself. Tyrell's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. "If he was so great, then why do you treat people like me like dirt? You call yourself a judge, but you don't act like one. You act like the world owes you something." The words stung more than Greaves cared to admit. Tyrell had hit him where it hurt the most, the hypocrisy of his actions. He wanted to push back, to lecture the boy, to remind him who was in charge here. But for the first time, Greaves felt the weight of his own failure. He wasn't just a judge. He wasn't just a man with the gavel. He was a man who had lost his way. Tyrell, sensing the shift in the room, continued, "You didn't just lose your way, did you, Judge? You know, the reason you can't stand me isn't because of me. It's because of who I remind you of. You see, I'm a part of something you tried to forget." Greaves froze. He didn't need to ask what Tyrell meant. He knew. Tyrell wasn't just his father's son. Tyrell was the living embodiment of everything Marcus Mason had stood for: justice, fairness, hope. Greaves had spent so many years hiding from that truth, running from the very legacy that had once inspired him. And now, standing before him, was the living, breathing reminder that Marcus Mason had been right all along. Tyrell continued, his voice lowering. "My dad saw people, not their mistakes. He believed that the law could be a path to redemption. And you just became part of a system that locks people away, keeps them there forever." Greaves' heart sank. The truth, spoken so plainly, felt like a punch to the gut. His entire career had been built on denying people like Tyrell a future, denying them the chance to be more than their circumstances. And now, this young man, this son of the man he had once admired, was holding a mirror up to his face. Tyrell stepped closer to the bench, his voice soft but piercing. "I'm not just here to get a slap on the wrist. I'm here to show you that your system doesn't work unless you believe in people, in second chances, in redemption, just like my father did." For a moment, Greaves couldn't speak. The room felt suffocating. The weight of his own mistakes pressed down on him, each breath feeling harder than the last. Finally, Greaves spoke, his voice cracked. "Your father, he was a great man, and I failed him." The admission, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air. For the first time in years, Judge Walter Greaves let go of his pride, his need to be the powerful authority figure. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth, that he had lost his way, that he had let bitterness and resentment take hold of him. And Tyrell, standing there, so much like his father, had just reminded him of the man he used to be, the man he had once aspired to be. Greaves cleared his throat, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "I'll reduce your sentence, Tyrell," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll clear your record, and I'll put you in a mentorship program, one that your father helped set up." Tyrell's eyes softened. "That's all I wanted, Judge. A chance, just like my dad would have given." As Tyrell left the courtroom, a whisper rippled through the gallery. "He's just like his dad." And for the first time in years, Judge Greaves felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The courtroom had grown quiet once more, the tension hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Judge Walter Greaves, still sitting at the bench, gripped the gavel with a trembling hand. He had just sentenced Tyrell Mason to community service, cleared his record, and assigned him to a youth mentorship program, one that had been set up by none other than Marcus Mason himself. For the first time in a long time, the gavel in his hand felt heavy, not because of the power it represented, but because of the weight of the truth that had finally broken through the walls of his own pride. The whispers in the courtroom had softened, but the atmosphere remained charged. Tyrell, his expression as calm as it had been from the moment he first stepped into this room, stood tall and poised. His eyes never left the judge, but there was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet understanding that he had done something today that would change more than just his own life. Greaves' gaze flickered to Tyrell one last time before he looked away, suddenly unsure of himself. The boy, no, the young man before him, had exposed something that Greaves hadn't been willing to face for years. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a man who had lived in the shadows of his own choices, a man who had forsaken everything Marcus Mason had taught him for the sake of power, for the sake of control. Greaves remembered a time when Marcus Mason had looked at him with the kind of pride he had always craved. Back then, Marcus had believed in him. He had given him the kind of guidance most young lawyers could only dream of. But somewhere along the way, Greaves had started to believe that he was above it all, that he was the one who deserved to be in charge, that his own ambitions were worth more than the integrity Marcus had instilled in him. Marcus had never sought the spotlight. He'd never craved the kind of recognition that Greaves had wanted, and in the end, it was Marcus who had earned the respect of everyone around him, while Greaves had become just another figurehead in the system, cold, unforgiving, and disconnected from the very people he was supposed to serve. Greaves forced himself to meet Tyrell's gaze again. The boy had spoken truthfully, but not cruelly. He had reminded Greaves of everything he had lost, everything he had forgotten. The quiet dignity Tyrell carried in his father's legacy was a mirror of the man Greaves had once hoped to be. And yet, here he was, standing before the boy, trying to make up for years of mistakes in one fleeting moment. Tyrell spoke, his voice breaking the silence that had taken over the courtroom. "You're not a bad man, Judge. You just forgot who you were." The words stung more than Greaves had anticipated. They were not accusatory, but gentle, as though Tyrell were speaking not just to the judge, but to the man who had once been full of promise, the man who had wanted to change the world, and yet had lost himself in the process. Greaves swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "I've lost a lot more than I realized. himself than to anyone else in the room. Tyrell tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. It's not too late, you know, for either of us. The room was silent for a long moment. Greaves wanted to argue, to say that it was too late for someone like him, too late to fix the mistakes he had made. But he couldn't. He couldn't deny the truth of what Tyrell had just said. It wasn't too late. As Greaves looked around the courtroom, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. People were looking at him. They weren't just afraid of him anymore. There was no fear in their eyes now, only an expectation. They weren't waiting for him to make his next harsh ruling. They were waiting for him to show who he truly was. The man who had been inspired by Marcus Mason. The man who had once believed in second chances. And for the first time in his career, Greaves didn't feel the need to hide behind his gavel, to assert his authority over the people in this room. Instead, he felt the weight of his decisions, the responsibility of the power he held, and the chance to make it right. Suddenly, there was a shift in the room. The atmosphere had changed completely. Greaves wasn't sure if it was the moment, or Tyrell's calm presence, or the sheer realization of his own failures, but something had shifted inside him. He had been blind to it all these years, but now he understood. "Your father," Greaves said, his voice breaking slightly. "He was the kind of man I wanted to be." Tyrell's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Then be that man. It's not too late." Greaves hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. What if he failed again? What if he couldn't live up to the man Marcus Mason had been? But then he looked at Tyrell, standing there with the same quiet dignity, and something inside him shifted again. Maybe it was the recognition of what he had done, or hadn't done. Maybe it was the realization that change wasn't just a dream, that redemption wasn't just a word. It was a choice. Greaves took a deep breath and, with newfound resolve, turned to Tyrell one last time. "I'm going to make it right," he said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "I promise." As Greaves looked out into the gallery, he realized that his promise wasn't just to Tyrell. It was to everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, to everyone who had been silenced or overlooked, to everyone who had been told they weren't worth the effort. "I'll start with you, Tyrell," Greaves said, the words coming out with an unexpected clarity. "And I'll make sure you're not the last." The room, once tense and charged with distrust, now hummed with a quiet sense of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the system wasn't just a tool of punishment. It could be a tool of redemption. As Tyrell walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Someone whispered, "Maybe there's hope after all." And for the first time in a long time, Greaves wasn't sure if he was talking about Tyrell or himself.